So now it is part 3 of the 301 course, where we are now at the qualitative analysis, social media dimensions. So previously we saw a lot of different metrics, numbers, charts, but right now what we're trying to do is something a bit more different, whereby we'll be looking at the common methodologies that you use to derive preliminary themes online, and also what is the process that a social analyst will have to apply to deep dive into qualitative data. Okay, so for a start, I'm pretty sure those of you who have logged into 2020 have seen this and will be familiar with a word cloud, something that I've also touched a bit on earlier. Word cloud is essentially a very visual way for us to look at the top keywords within a certain topic. So in 2020, what you're able to see is that for the keywords that are most frequently mentioned, it will be in blue, followed by green, and also yellow. So it's just really intuitive for you to at a glance see what are the top keywords and to help you come up with preliminary themes from inference. So at a glance, I might be able to see, okay, people are talking about different recipes because the top keywords are things like cream, milk, and egg. And so if you want to see what are the specific posts that are mentioning these keywords, or what are the other words that are associated with each of these, what you can do is actually go to the word cloud, left click on it to see what is the word cloud that's associated with that specific word. So for instance, I have clicked on cookies here, and this new word cloud that is appearing is basically I'll call it a sub word cloud. And what it is the words that are also closely associated with the word cookies earlier. But if I want to see, like say under here, there's entertainment, what are the raw conversations? I have to right click with the view conversations icon popping up, click on it, and you'll be able to look at all the raw post that is available here. Okay, so this is for word cloud, but a lot of times when people are talking about specific keywords, or when they're mentioning these certain terms, it does not actually give you, what is the theme behind it, because you can see the examples here, it's just words, and the inference that I had here will be something I still have to do manually, because I'll still have to look at the conversation, eyeball it to see which can I cluster together, right? That is not the best way to go forward when identifying preliminary themes, which is why we have this new functionality on 2020, which is called top themes. And so what this does is that it has an AI powered algorithm to help you bucket this post rather than via the keywords. It's more so done in a way that you put you cluster it according to their meaning and context. So for instance, if I'm saying that the cake that I just had is the bomb, versus they found a bomb in the cake shop, it has the word cake and bomb, but it's vastly different things that we're talking about. One is about how much I enjoy my dessert, and the other one is likely a case of terrorism. So it's not the smartest way to look at keywords in itself. But with clustering themes, it's always important to look at the entire context. And so this is what top themes does for you. So here, what you're seeing with the clustering, it's more descriptive, right? It's not just a word in itself. It's things like bakery products, festivities and celebrations, consumption moments. So it helps you make sense of the conversations that are out there without you having to look at every single one of it. So similar to the word cloud, it can also be clicked on. It is also an interactive function. But before we go into that, I just want to point out that on 2020, you can also get a gauge of the sentiment around these themes. So green represents a positive sentiment and red for the negative ones. So if you're interested to look deeper into what each of these means, again, you can left click on it to deep dive into the sub themes. And once you're interested to see what are the raw conversations, just right click and the raw post will appear in a pop-up. Yeah. Okay, but something to bear in mind with AI is that it is, after all, a machine, right? It will not, I wouldn't say it will never, but it will not be, for now, as good as someone going in with the industry understanding and the cultural context to like analyze the data. And this is where social analyst comes into play, because if the machines are able to understand everything, then we will not need the human analysts. But at least at this point of time, there is no way for the machine to be able to cluster things meaningfully in a way that a human can, which is why we'll need the process to do a qualitative deep dive, whereby an analyst goes in to look at the large data set to derive meaningful insights. Okay, so you should be pretty familiar with these steps already. We have already covered this in the third part of 101. But in this section of the course, I'll be going into each of these items and to show you what are the things that you can action on from here. Right, so step one is we want to have a very specific topic to explore. So right now we have already put in data onto the 2020 platform, right? We have this wealth of data, but there are so many questions that we want to answer. And how are we able to answer each of these? There are two approaches that we can do this, which is a top-down approach, as well as, top-down approach and a bottom-up approach. So for top-down, what it means is that if you have a very specific hypothesis that you are working with, and you have very specific questions that you want to ask, then this is where you use this approach. So like between Facebook and Twitter, where should I spend my money on, or for my marketing efforts for consumers in Southeast Asia? As with brand proposition, your brand will only have that few proposition, and you will want to know which one resonates best with consumers online, right? So these are things that are pretty limited. You have a fixed number of items that you want to measure for a top-down approach. But for bottom-up, how it differs is that you're essentially casting the net. You're asking a very broad question and letting the data in its entirety speak for itself. So which are the most popular snacking flavors in Singapore, right? It's super broad. It can range from anything to anything like the mainstream flavors to like flavors that you've never heard before, right? And what are the main pillars of sustainability? These are also things that are very broad that you might not even think about before looking at the data. So then the many people will then say that, okay, then I will always want to use the bottom-up approach, because then I'll be able to cover everything that's out there, and then I get the most meaningful insight. I can really understand what's happening in the outside world. But something to note is that not every one of these findings that you get from a bottom-up approach will be actionable for your case. You really need to consider what are you able to do with the insights that you get from this. So say if I'm from the marketing team and a product has been launched already, there's really not much I can do with regards to the product specifics. So what are the product features? What do people like? I can't do much about it. I can't edit it. Yes, if the product team is interested in these insights, it'll be for them. But for my purposes, I can't do much about it. So what I'll need to know is like what are the nuances and what are the very specific messaging and content that can get people to buy my product, because that is what I can action on and that is what I want to action on. So again, it boils down to what your business is able to work on based on the findings. It's not always the best case to do a bottom-up approach and get the most exhaustive insights out there, when you can get very specific ones that you can ultimately make a decision on. Once you have a concept of the specific topics that you want to explore, this is where you pluck it out from the overall data that you've collected in 2020, and that's how you review and explore the data. So this is the data relevant, which was conceptualized based on the top-down or bottom-up approach that we had earlier. And ultimately, at the end of step 2, what we want is to identify some themes after exploring the data. But if you think about it, right now we are only having this concept of the data that is relevant. We haven't had a way to look at it yet. And so how we can look at the data is through creating displays on 2020. So what this means is to create topics or subtopics, and also to filter relevant data using booleans on search bar if the thing you're trying to analyze is not as permanent yet. So if any of this sounds foreign to you, this has been covered in 201 Boolean Mastery. And if you need a refresher, do go back to the syllabus and have a look at it, because it is all covered there. And so once you have created the topics and subtopics, and you have a way to visualize it nicely on the platform, the next step is to look at the data, to review and explore it. And once you've eyeballed it, you will be able to tell if the data is clean or not. So if the data is clean, what you're able to do is to pick up a couple of preliminary themes from there. And if it is not, it's likely a case where there is a lot of other like competing conversations out there that is not relevant to what you're looking at. And when that happens, you'll need to do a data optimization process on it. This is something that we've covered in 101 Introduction to Social Analytics. So again, if you don't know what that is, do revisit the syllabus. But essentially what this does is that it clears out the conversations that are not relevant to the things that you want to analyze for the question that you have here. Okay, you might be thinking, okay, I did it once already, data optimization, when I was configuring my booleans and pulling in the data, but why do I need to do it again? It's because at this point of time, you have a very specific question that you want to answer. So the data optimization at this point of time wouldn't be as exhaustive as the previous one, because it's already clean one time, right? It's already clean the first time round. So this data optimization will just be a case where you want to find the best and the most relevant data for your use case in order to identify your themes. Okay, so once all that is sorted, you have these themes that are laid out. The next step will be to start tagging these themes to the conversations that you have, the overall data set. But then the question is, if the data set is huge, what do I do? Because most of the times when people are talking about things online, it does have enormous volume. And if I were to take, for instance, snacking, right? Easily snacking in a small island in Singapore, if I were to take a month's worth of conversation, it can come up to like hundreds and thousands of it. So if I were to look at it across 6 months, hundreds of thousands of conversation is just not viable for an analyst to look through. And so what we'll need to do in these cases is to do data sampling. So data sampling should only be done for a data set that has been cleaned. So which is why data optimization was so important, because we want to make sure that there's no noise in there. And if you were to take a sample of unclean data, the likelihood is that there'll be a lot of junk in there too. So once the data set is clean, what you can do is to take at least 300 sample size or 10% sampling, whichever that you think is sufficient and possible for your bandwidth at that point of time. So again, this boils back to the judgment of the analyst to see whether you're getting insightful themes, if you're getting nuances that you want to get to answer your initial question from there. If it's not, you'll need to expand the sample size. Otherwise, the sample size of 300 should suffice for you to get a good scan of the conversations that are happening. Okay, so now that we have the data set, we also have some preliminary themes. The next step will be to start tagging this data. And what I mean by tagging this data is that with every single post, to put a value to each of it to see which team does it fall under. So we have two methods to go about this. The first one is the collection function on 2020. And the second one is by downloading the data set for manual tagging. So there's no better way or a worse way, but the collection function on 2020 just makes it a lot easier because it's a lot more visual, and you can interact with the post a lot easier that way. But if you're someone who likes to work off a spreadsheet, you like all your data set in columns and rows, then I would suggest that you do the manual tagging by downloading the data. So we look through the first method, which is the collection function on 2020. So all you have to do is to log in to the platform. Just click on all conversations, and select the filter that you want to look at to access the data set that you want. So in this case, we'll be looking at a year's worth of data. And we'll be looking at all topics here. Maybe select Indonesia and apply filter. So this will give us access to all the raw conversations that has fulfilled the filters above. And this is where I can start looking at the data. I mean, I might see some that are relevant, some that are not relevant to the teams. And once I come across one that is relevant, I can hover over it, click add to collection, and select from the drop-down icon there the different teams that I want to tag it to. Okay, so the different items here are actually the collections that I've created. So what the collections are essentially folders that you want to put the post in there. So if say I have team A and I want to put certain posts into team A, this is where I tag it in so that later on when I go into this folder, I can see all the posts that I have tagged accordingly. So these are the ones that I have created beforehand, which is why I can just select it from this drop-down button. But if it's a new team, right, and you want to create a new collection, just come here and fill in the name of the new team that you want to create and click save. It's all the same. And once you have this new collection added, the next time round, you can just get it from this drop-down button. Okay, click save, and voila, it will go over to the collection area. So in order to get here, just click on collaborate, collections, and you will get full view to the different folders or collections that you have created, which makes it a lot easier for you to look back at the different posts within each team. Okay, so this is one way of doing it through the collection section in 2020. But another way to do it is by manually downloading the data set. So same thing, select the filters that you want to look at. Again, we'll do 1 year data here, looking at all the topics from Indonesia and applying the filter. And once the conversations have been loaded, you just need to go up to this icon here at the top, select between CSV and the Excel sheet format to be downloaded. And a pop-up will appear for you to select the different variables that you want to look at. So usually I like to just download everything because then I can choose which to exclude or not. And I might need to make some pivots here and there. But if you just have a couple of variables that you want to look at, just feel free to select it also and click on download. Once you click on download, the download request will be submitted and you will receive an email to that is linked to the email registered to your 2020 login. So there'll be a link, you click on it, it'll directly download to your desktop. All right. Okay, so this is how it will look like for an example. It is basically an Excel sheet. And CID is the unique post identifier. So don't worry too much about this, but what you'll need to look at are the different items here, right? Who are the authors, the post data, and to do your team tagging from here. Okay, so what I did here was I had a team. I also had a sub team just in case that there are deeper layers that I want to delve into at a later time. But what you can do is to infer this from the post data and to classify the team. But also, if you want to get more context as to what is the full range of the article and the image that is available, feel free to click on the post URL to have the full context on what you're analyzing here. Okay, so that was it, right? We had the overall conversations from 2020. We select a small group that we're interested in for our topic and analysis. We have the preliminary themes identified. We've tagged each of the conversations in our data set accordingly. And the next step will be to review these themes and to cluster it into macro themes. So what this means is that sometimes when we're looking at the themes in a discrete manner, so right now, if you're looking at the 12 overall themes that are identified, it's not telling you much. But when you cluster it in meaningful ways, then maybe you can get deeper insights from it. So I'm just borrowing an example from what we saw in 101, where we're looking at the activities that people are doing during COVID-19 when they are able to go out, like when the lockdown is lighter and you're able to do some physical activity. What do people typically do? So like these are the overall 12 themes identified. But if we were to look at this, it's not very helpful, right? All I can see is okay, cool. There's like hiking, yoga, people also stay at home and do some mindfulness activity, which is great. And perhaps I'm able to tell quantitatively that one is more than the other just based on the number of conversations that I've tagged. But what will be really useful is to start applying the industry or local understanding to these themes identified. So come up with a couple of hypotheses as to, if I were to group these themes in different way, how will it play out? Will it be able to tell me the deeper motivations of people and subsequently show me that, okay, maybe more people are motivated to do things one way than the other. Maybe I'll give more specific example over here. So for this case, maybe one of the hypotheses that I can give is the activities mainly outdoors or indoors. And I will want to analyze it that way because people are typically more likely to stay indoors because their fear of being exposed to COVID-19. That's why they want to stay indoors. But I'm also curious to see, are they more likely to do activities in a group or individual setting? Because although they have this fear of exposure to COVID-19, they might be so bored of staying at home for the longest time and not socializing that they actually still want to hang out with people at the end of the day. So will that cluster mean something? And thirdly, are the activities mostly free or paid? So this is more of a cultural context that you're able to put in because like based on experience, Singaporeans are usually very appreciative of like free and good deals. So is it a case that if we were to group things that are free, like more people are into it versus the ones that are paid? So once we apply this hypothesis that we have to the overall themes, the colors will look very different. Like how it is being clustered will look very different because say for outdoors and indoors, right? It is different activities versus if it's individually versus a group, and also whether it's free or paid. So the takeaway from this is that at the end of the day, what we're trying to do is not just to identify the discrete themes, but it's also to see are there other layers that we can add into it. So based on the motivations that they have, how can we group it together differently to come up with macro themes that will make more sense for our actionable insights. And once we have that, the final step will be to integrate the findings with quantitative insights. And how we're able to do that, we'll be covering it in part 4 of this session after the break. So that's about it for now. And before we move on to our break, we have a second quiz, which is around the qualitative analysis here. So 3 questions again. First one, which of the following is a function of a word cloud? It's straightforward to identify themes, identify sentiment behind each keyword, or to identify the most frequently mentioned keywords. Secondly, which of the following is not an approach in identifying relevant topics? So this is step one. Remember, there were two approaches that was brought up. Which of these three is not one of them? Thirdly, true or false? Data optimization is no longer required after Boolean configuration. We'll just give it a while for everyone to fill in the polls. Okay, let's do this for another minute before we close the poll. And it will be break time. So again, before we go on our break, feel free to ping any questions in the chat or ask any questions that you might have so that we can address them and help you clear any doubts that you have before we move on to the next section. All right, the results are out. So for the first question, which of this is a function of the word clouds? And that is right. To identify the most frequently mentioned keywords. Most of you got it right. Only 3 of you selected to identify preliminary themes. So for preliminary themes, yes, you'll be able to do that on a word cloud via some sort of analysis on your own. It's not completely wrong, but if you want a more direct way to identify preliminary themes, it will be through the top topics cluster that I mentioned earlier. Secondly, which of this is not an approach in identifying relevant topics? Everyone got it right, which is side by side. So only 2 approaches, top down and bottom up. Lastly, data optimization is still required after Boolean configuration. Most of you got it right, yes. So as I was mentioning earlier, the first data optimization that we'll be doing is when we configure the Booleans to pull in the conversations from the online ecosystem into 2020. But after we have specific topics that we want to look at to answer our research questions, then we will have a separate topic or a Boolean to put in our search bar to identify this subset of conversations. And from there, it will still be necessary for us to do a quick data optimization if the conversations that we're seeing is not as clean as we like it to be for team identification. Yep, so that's it for the first 3 parts of the 301 course. Do we have any questions? Let's see. Okay, I haven't seen any question in the chat yet. Okay, if that is the case, I think we can move on to for our break. But during the break, if you think of any questions that you might have, just feel free to ping in the group chat too, and we will address it either right after the break or at the end of the entire session. So thanks for staying with me for the first half of the course. I'll be passing the time over to Kay after this, and we'll see you at 3:15.